بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا بفضلك علما وتعليما إنك على كل شيء قدير. بسم الله. So welcome one and all. Abdul Basit Atif Justice. So please, this is not a formal lesson. I'm not a scholar, I'm just a student, and so please, at any moment, anytime, please feel free to just ask any questions, inshallah. Please do have a look at the course description. We will be going over specific material, specific times. So inshallah, today we're going over certain issues, and we'll be roughly covering the whole book of Al-Fiqh al-Madhahib al-Arba', Islamic Jurisprudence according to the four schools, in a very, very kind of not tangential is the word, very, very without much detail at all. We're just flicking over some of the chapters to see kind of roughly what the main ideas are. So today's lesson, inshallah ta'ala, we'll be talking about jurisprudence as a skill, not an invention, the proto-madhabs, the four schools, primary sources of Islamic law, interpretive principles, conflicts in primary sources, and juristic principles. Now, somebody with a legal background would laugh that you can talk about this in 1 hour, and obviously it is somewhat laughable. And so that's why I've given a whole load of references there for you to read, to have a look at. The two most important, arguably the two most important works to look at are the first one, according to the four schools, to read over these 2 months, shall we have 8 lessons in total, and the Search for God's Law. Those are the most important of the 2 books, but otherwise the other books are all very important as well. So I'm going to touch upon certain things, by no means at all give a full explanation of anything. This does not take the place of any university course or any serious study with any normal organization. I mean, any normal kind of organized way of studying. Just a way of introducing people like yourselves, intelligent, proactive people who are interested in Islam, want to apply Islam, want to learn about what's going on, to have an overview of what's going on. Okay. So without further ado, so as I mentioned, please cut in at any time, not a problem at all. So the master craftsman. So the first thing to understand is that Islamic jurisprudence is basically a system of characterizing rituals, transactions, crime, and politics in keeping with the Quran and Sunnah. So how is it different to any normal legal system? Is that usually in law we don't talk about rituals, right? What's that got to do with anything? What's prayer? What you do in your own time got to do with a court scenario? So we will find that there are, good 60 to 70% of the principles in rituals also apply to normal law. Okay, and this also tells us that there is as we'll cover in one lesson, when we say jurisprudence, fiqh, it doesn't really mean law, because what's the legality of rituals? Well, there are some legal issues with rituals. There are legal issues to do with rituals. There are, rituals can come into court at certain times. It's true. And they are relevant, but most of the time they're not. And so a law, as we will discuss, cannot exist outside of a state, outside of some kind of polity, because there's no way to enforce a law. Therefore, it's not a law. Whereas jurisprudence, just the way of organizing human actions, is it, for example, permissible? Does God accept, does Allah accept that I do a contract like this? Is not really a legal issue, it's a moral issue. And so it crosses on morality, crosses on rituals. It does touch upon spirituality, but only, again, tangentially. But it does have real things that we talk about in law, right? When we study law, all of these things come up. So just welcome, I want to welcome the newcomers. So Fahima, Fahad, Abida, Aisha, please, as I mentioned at the beginning to the others, please feel free to stop me at any time if anything is confusing or you have any questions. Bismillah. So that's what it is. It's a system of characterizing rituals. And what do we do when we study? A jurist comes up with a system in order to label every single thing in basically 7 ways. He can label every single human action into one of 7 things in view of the Quran and the Sunnah, right? Not exactly 7, some will disagree, but basically 7. Is it sinful, or is it obligatory? Is it something that must be done or something that must not be done? Or is it something praiseworthy or blameworthy, or is it neither nor? So that's 5 moral categories. And then, is it valid or is it invalid? So again, in normal legal systems, you can talk about a valid contract. But in Islamic jurisprudence, we can talk about a valid contract and also a valid marriage and a valid Hajj. Did you actually go on Hajj or not? We're going to label it as valid or invalid, right? And we're going to see a lot of the systems are the same systems, okay, generally speaking. And so in order to understand Islamic jurisprudence as an Islamic science, we have to look at, which is again in the reading list, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, his, I can't remember what the Latin word for it, the Greek word for it, proglamon, something what it is, but there it's in the reading list, Ibn Khaldun, and his idea of the master craftsman. So Ibn Khaldun was a historian and a scholar of Islamic sciences. He studied civilization, compared civilization, and came up with certain systems. How do civilizations work, and more particularly, how do civilizations peak and decline? Is it circular? Is it linear, etc.? And so he has various systems that he's observed throughout the histories of the world, the various civilizations of the world, and in particular in the Muslim world as well. And so basically what he says is, we look at all humans, we have this human potential to do things, right? To build things, to work out things, to discover things, to write novels, whatever it is. And then there is societal inertia. There is a direction that society is going in. People want something. People want, for example, poetry. People want art. People want solutions. People want entertainment. Whatever it is that people want, that's a social inertia. And then we have realized human potentials. So those human potentials that were built up inside you, the ability in principle to do something, is then realized over time by society pushing it in that way. And then that results in specialization, and there are other stages, right? And then you get someone who specializes in something and they hand on their skill to the next generation. So the point is, there is a potential that is there, and it takes time to become realized. And so, for example, one human potential, the primal ability to work out the halal haram of everything. So here we are as students of the Prophet. He's telling us this is halal, this is haram, don't do this. Sometimes explaining why, sometimes not explaining why, sometimes giving us principles, sometimes not letting us ask questions. We see how the Quran works, and we have this potential within us to kind of do the same thing, to copy and paste and keep that process going. There is a social inertia, the Muslim civilization wanting to know what is halal haram, or the lack of thereof, right? So people, for example, complain of, why is Islamic jurisprudence not very interesting today? So, well, there isn't much social inertia, meaning nobody really cares, right? And so when social inertia, when that desire, that drive for something ceases, that skill declines over generations. And realized human potentials in Islamic jurisprudence at its peak, right? So Ibn Khaldun historically is talking in the 8th the 8th century Hijri, and as we're going to read, he's going to talk about things reaching their peak in Islamic civilization. So we have a master craftsman, so the Prophet himself, okay, who teaches people how to do halal and haram. We have his student, the Sahaba, his students, the students of the Prophet ﷺ, and there is an educational activity that they go through. So is it that he mentioned something to them, or he stopped them from doing something, etc. Then we have a written depository where are these things saved, certain bytes of information, which is very important. So the hadith or the verse of the Quran, certain bytes of information, but that's not the information. That's not the process. There was the master and the student. Something happened between these two people, and the bytes of information, the little piece of information, are part of that process. They're very important, but they're not it. So being a jurist and knowing hadith are not the same thing. Being a judge and knowing the whole of US law are not the same thing. There is a knack, an ability, in Arabic, a malaka, right? A skill that is passed on from master to student through that educational activity. And part of that thing is then enables him to access that written depository in a clever way. Again, in law, you don't read every single letter of the law. It's impossible. You can't do that. But you're given the skills to do that. Right? And then we have cross-generational cooperation. So then the student becomes a master, specialization. So this student then uses these different things, and as he creates more, he's a master himself and he creates more students, each of them branch off, realizing more human potential, and you get specializations. Okay, specializations. So again, we don't have time to go over this, but you get, for example, someone specialized in different madhabs. Someone's specialized in Maliki fiqh or Shafi fiqh. Someone specialized in marriage law. Someone's specialized in Islamic finance, etc. Specializations. Okay, and this is what happens in all spheres of human being. The scientist, he splits into the doctor and the this and the that. And then you get people who are working in theory, people who are working in surgery, people working this, and then you get very specific, subcategories of these things, all through the same process. Nobody just came and did it by themselves. There was always a master and student in the process. So he said, so Ibn Khaldun says craftsmanship. So he's talking about in the most general sense, pottery, scholarship, astronomy, medicine, Islamic jurisprudence. In these crafts is initially low quality. It's very simple, right? If you take the limited, finite cases that are solved in the Quran and Sunnah, they're limited. And human intellects, there are principles, there are legal principles in the Quran and Sunnah, that's true, but not that many. And human intellects continually branch out its various types and combinations by actualizing, right? I'm British, I write it with an S, you guys in America, well, I'm here right now, write it with the Z, is its various potentialities until the craft is gradually perfected. So again, apply that to metalwork, apply that to dentistry, whatever it is. Jurisprudence is the same thing. It develops. Everything, the potential is there throughout all, but it's just the bringing out of that potential. So we're not trying to say that we've come up with a new religion. But I'm saying when a mufti today comes along and solves a issue of Islamic finance, he's doing the self-same job that the Prophet was teaching us, but it just took time to be actualized. The principle, everything to come together, principles to be there, and it takes time for it to be actualized. This perfection doesn't happen suddenly. Hence, a book of fiqh today is not the same as a book of fiqh at the time of the Sahaba. It takes time for those things to happen, for all those cases to actually come to light and all the discussions to actually happen. But it takes years and generations because actualizing potentialities takes time. You may have an amazing skill at singing. Okay, well, then you have to go and learn how to sing and then learn what kind of songs you want to sing and take that time, and then it's there. But the potential was always there, but its fruition takes time, especially matters that relate to craftsmanship. This is why you find that crafts in rural areas, so Ibn Khaldun himself compared, for example, people in the sub-Sahara to the cities of for example, of Egypt and North Africa, they lack quality. It's very simple. And often only simple crafts exist. So again, in our tradition, if you look at all the most significant books of significant works, where do they come from? They come from major cities of Islamic civilization. They don't come from a desert, for example, even though the religion came from the desert, right? Plato's what's his book? What is it? Plato's works, for example, I can't think of one of his works right now. They come out of Athens. That's a place of civilization. They don't come from the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, for example. The Republic, for example. When civilization flourishes, so there's this continual demand. Everybody wants halal and haram. We're all caring about halal and haram. And affluence creates demands for crafts. People want to buy, for example, a house with Islamic mortgage, for example. Their potentialities are actualized. But if they're not, if I'm quite happy to, for example, buy a house without a Islamic mortgage, then the potentials will not be actualized. If, for example, I live in a Muslim country today, and everyone's very happy for example, the state to be secular, then crime and punishment will look like it existed 100 years ago. Whereas if everyone's saying, no, we want a modern Islamic, modern version of halal and haram, we want to find, for example, have people doing PhDs in Islamic criminology, then that all those potentials that are already there will come to light and you'll have something. The Islamic principles of forensic science, but do they exist today? No, because there are very few Muslim countries that actually care about for example, Sharia law, for example. And so it just becomes very retarded, not in a bad sense. It's just, it's going to be similar answers that were answered 100 years ago. And we're just kind of pasting them out again, but potentials take time, right? And so he says the marketplaces of these religious disciplines. So notice he uses this word marketplaces. He's saying it's the same thing. The thing that drives theater, the thing that drives pottery, the things that drives electronics is the same thing that drives religious disciplines. I care about hadith, whether it's true or not, you care about it. We go and ask the same person, he asks someone else. This whole activity of critiquing hadith happens, and then there we go. The principle was already there, but it took time for that to be realized. So these religious disciplines have thrived in religious community, in this religious community in an unsurpassable manner. So he's saying that basically what's happening is we're at the peak of a civilization, right? The peak of a civilization. In the 8th century Hijri, across the world, you're going to find this point where the most authoritative works across the board are written in hadith, in tafsir, in fiqh, in Arabic language, for example, anything, you name it, right? Theology. Scholarly discernments have reached a level that cannot be exceeded. Nomenclatures to terms have been refined, and disciplines have arranged with a beauty that cannot be outdone, right? And that's basically what he observed in the 8th century, and that's basically what happens. Today, the authorities are the same authority. Yeah, there's a lot that's happened since the 8th century Hijri. It's not true to say things are stagnant at all. The concept of what we call asr al-inhitat, the concept that things declined, is not true at all. We will try and demonstrate that, inshallah, but the concept is there. So what does that mean? If the Prophet ﷺ's community remained in the desert, they would be exactly the same. There would be no new scenarios. There would be no new concepts. It would just be literally copy and paste. As opposed to when Islam became a civilization and people dealing with new scenarios, you come up with principles and this and this and this, and then we get this whole opera of halal haram called jurisprudence. Right? Okay, so then we get 4 edited schools of fiqh, and we'll talk about these in a second. Schools, these key schools of how to do fiqh: Hanafi, Maliki, Shafi'i, Hanbali. They're all, the process of recording happens. What is the actual rulings? Editing, what does it mean? What does it not mean? Correcting, where are the mistakes in it that could be corrected? Expanding, what new scenarios could it be applied to? And then pass it on. And then the same thing happens again and again and again and again. Same process. What was actually said? Did it mean this? Did it not mean this? Well, if he said that doesn't make sense. So critiquing is a very important thing to understand. This continual process of critiquing, generation to generation, is also important part of it, because the point that is passed on is not the bytes of information. This is halal, this is haram. It is the process of doing halal haram, the process, right? And so yes, there is obviously Quranic and prophetic precedence. Obviously that's important, and precedence is very important, but it is not in principle binding, right? Precedence is not in principle binding when we come to things that are not primary sources. So this process of then correcting a school then is a greater than the individual that started that school. Okay, so that's just a very, very quick run through. Inshallah, we managed to. Any questions so far? Okay, so that's just a general overview there. And then the proto-madhabs. So today, today we have 4 schools of fiqh. Right? You could add a 5th, I guess. The way that some things are in. For Sunni Muslims, we have Hanafi, Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali, right? And some people don't ascribe to anything, or some people will pick and choose. But ultimately, usually their answers will come to one of these 4 things, right? And so, as you mentioned, there's this whole process of a master and a student, that whole process happening, and we get specialization, right? So the continual demand for something creates specialization. And so we get the companions of the Sahaba. So they are people who are students of the Prophet ﷺ, live with the Prophet ﷺ, fought alongside the Prophet ﷺ, married the Prophet ﷺ, some of them, for example, were children of the Prophet ﷺ, people who were part of that whole experience and spread Islam thereafter. Some of them were jurists. Some of them had this knack and they had picked up this knack of solving things, and they actually answered questions, difficult questions about halal and haram during the life of the Prophet ﷺ. But most of them didn't. Most of them were good people, wanted to practice this religion, but were not involved in the details. They didn't know the details. They wouldn't be able to answer those things. They had to ask either the Prophet ﷺ himself or other people. And some of those people, some of these jurists, they had circles of apprentices, people who around them who studied with them, thought about their ideas, refined their ideas, debated with them, and took on that trend. They started this trend. And some of them had no circle. Right? There are certain scholars you'll hear, so-and-so, and we don't really know much about their fatwa. We don't really know what they were doing. They didn't have a circle. So Ali al-Madini is a very, very important hadith scholar. He's not a jurist. He's a very, very important historian and a very, very important hadith scholar. He's the teacher, one of the prime teachers of Imam al-Bukhari. Okay, Imam al-Bukhari. So he dies in the beginning of the, I believe, 250, I think, in the beginning of the 3rd century, Hijri. Very, very important hadith scholar. And he's the teacher of Imam al-Bukhari. Right, one of the most authored and one of the most authentic, most insignificant works in hadith. He says, there were none among the companions of the Prophet ﷺ who had students who would give fatwa according to their opinions and adopt their way, save for 3. So notice this concept of a trend. There's a circle of a trend. So somebody has a system, and people are picking up on that system. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Ibn Abbas. He mentions 3. Right? Each had students who adopted their positions and gave fatwa. And then he goes on to list what are these circles. So what he does in the beginning of his book, Al-Ilal, he mentions these fiqh circles. So there are these 3 circles among the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, and then the circles that come off after those. So these are these fiqh traditions that are starting. Like, for example, we've got this original Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, and we get Aristotelian and Neo-Aristotelian. It branches off, right? Same kind of idea in any human development of anything. So it says, the students of Abdullah Mas'ud who recited Quran as he did, gave fatwa in accordance to his opinion and went his way. Notice the word madhab. Madhab is not a term that we've created today, nor a term that they created in the 8th century. This is in the early 3rd century, Al-Ali al-Madini referring to the students of the Sahaba following the madhab. So the students of the Sahaba following the madhab of the students of the Prophet ﷺ. So everybody, of course, the Sahaba were all on the madhab of the Prophet ﷺ. And then each Sahabi, the jurist, followed certain schools. So then he mentioned so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, and these people, and then who's the most important person of these? He mentions these circles, etc. And so the picture that we get from Ali al-Madini, and in fact, just a cursive study of thing, is that we have 3 key circles in early jurisprudence. The circle of Abdullah Mas'ud, who went to Iraq in Kufa. So again, major, powerful, significant, politically, militarily, culturally, very significant place. He's in a very significant place. He's not in the desert. He goes out. Abdullah ibn Abbas, who's in Mecca. So again, at that point, still very significant. People are coming there a lot trying to solve problems. And Zayd ibn Thabit, who is in Medina, who was, again, at this time, is still very, very significant. Later on, it will be insignificant. So over time, you will find less and less works, for example, less and less culture, civilization coming out of Mecca and Medina because this is in the middle of the desert, right? But you will find it now and then, right? So the point is, civilization comes from places of civilization where there's money, power, conflict. The issues, comes out of Paris, comes out of London, New York, San Francisco, for example. There's a reason why the jazz comes from San Francisco and doesn't come from the middle of the Atlantic, because there's no one in the middle of the Atlantic, right? And so even if someone, this is how civilization works. Okay, so then they have their students and their grand students. We have this circle happening, common ideas. So he has 2 things that are happening here: common themes, systems in their head, and common fatwa. They're not always agreeing, but for common, similar kind of ideas. And Ibn Abbas with his students, and Zayd ibn Thabit in Medina with his students. And this basically turns into what we call the Kufan school, and the Meccan school, and the Medinan school. Okay? And so it's not just one person. It's a whole group of people. They have common fatwa, common systems, common way of looking at things. Okay. And then we have these. So Ali Madini mentions who was like the grand figure of the Kufan school, Sufyan al-Thawri. Sufyan al-Thawri. Who is the grand figure of the Meccan school? Sufyan ibn Uyayna and Ibn Jurayj. Okay, muhaddithin, very famous scholars. And then who is the grand figure that is produced of the Medinan school? Malik ibn Anas, right? The person who established the Maliki school. So this is what Ali al-Madini says. We can add a little bit more information to this, a little bit more, salt and pepper, so to speak. That Sayyidina Ali is also very, very significant in this Kufan school. Sayyidina Ali is also very significant. So Sayyidina Ali is the person who moved the Khilafah, the Caliphate, from Medina to Kufa. So it's a very significant place. So he's very significant in that system of fiqh as well. Also in Medina, there's also Abdullah ibn Umar, who is very, very significant, and Aisha radiallahu anha is also very significant. So a lot of the fatwa of the Medinan school revolve around these three people and others, and key students, for example, Sa'id al-Musayyib, for example, in that school, Ibrahim al-Nakha'i, who's an early scholar there. These are key people who have different ways of looking at things. And also Imam Abu Hanifa is very, very significant. The two greatest products of the Kufan school is Sufyan al-Thawri and Abu Hanifa. And then we have out of the Maliki school, so we have others as well that we can add to the Medinan school. Al-Awza'i, who was actually in Damascus. And that's the original school of Muslim Spain, right? Original school of Muslim Spain. Al-Awza'i. He was in Damascus, but he's greatly really connected to the Medinan school. And Layth ibn Sa'd, who's in Egypt, was also greatly connected to the Medinan school with some differences, notable differences, but he's also of that similar kind of teachers, similar kind of fiqh. And then we have, in reality, we can add Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Umar. So Sayyidina Abu Bakr and Umar are relevant to all schools of fiqh, right? So who are they irrelevant to? You can say they're irrelevant, for example, to the Shia, right? So to the Shia, these are not relevant people, but actually to the Sunni schools, Abdullah ibn Umar and Abu Bakr and Abdullah ibn Umar can be quoted by all traditions. These are almost like primary sources for them. Okay, they're very, very significant. So there will be key fatwa, key things that are done by Abu Bakr and Umar that you'll find in all four schools. Okay, and ultimately they all go back. Everyone's basing their fiqh also on the hadith, of course, and the Quran. And so, but so obviously that's all that, right? So the Prophet is the prime teacher. Abu Bakr and Umar are like the secondary teacher to all of them, and then we have branches off. So then what happens is we have Imam Malik, which is the head of the Maliki school, Imam Shafi, who's a student of Imam Malik, and he's branching off again off the Maliki school. So Imam Shafi is very, very much of the Medinan school, right? Very much of the Medinan school. There's many, many things that you'll find. Imam Shafi and what the students of that, what they said, the same thing. In inheritance, we're going to see, for example, Zayd ibn Thabit. You're going to find him in the Shafi school. You're going to find him in the Maliki school. But you're going to find Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, for example, in the Hanafi school. Right? Key things today. Right? Key things today, for example, in inheritance law in Saudi Arabia versus somewhere like, for example, Syria. Syria, who's still on the Ottoman system, which is Hanafi, you're going to find a key thing that in the legal system that it goes back to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, as opposed to, for example, in Morocco with the Malikis, or Saudi Arabia with loosely Hanbali, you're going to find it based on a certain issue in inheritance. It's based on Zayd ibn Thabit, for example. So these people are very important in this whole process. So now we can it's to say that Imam Shafi is just a product, an extension of the Medina school is not really fair, because they draw a lot from the other schools as well. So what I've done is I've kind of drawn it across, because Imam Shafi also studied with the students of Imam Abu Hanifa and also took a lot from that. Imam Ahmad as well took a lot from that as well, and a lot from everyone's drawing here and there from other schools as well. So this is a very a great generalization. To say that people are really like this boxed in is not really fair at all. Is not really fair at all. But this is a general kind of loosed way. But the idea is, you can see that this specialization, everything branches and goes back to one thing. Right? Every jurist goes back to an origin. Goes back to, he doesn't just come out of nothing. Nobody sat down and read the Quran and Sunnah and started giving fatwa. Nobody did that. Rather, they are a product of a legal tradition. They're a product of the Hanbali school, which is a product of the Shafi'i school, which is a product of the Maliki school, which is a product of the Medina school, which is a product of key student jurists of the Sahaba, who is a product of the Prophet. That's how it works. So every jurist fits into one of these systems. And if you don't fit into the system, then you're not part of that student master and student system, and you never get the system. You just have your own thing. You're not coming out of a tradition at all, right? Imagine today, for example, I say, that's it, I'm going to rule America, and this is legal, this is illegal. And everyone's looking at me like, were you trained in law? Did you ever read any law? Like, no, zero. Come out of zero. I just think this is good and that's bad. That's it. Well, the idea of a contract, no idea, don't know. Right? And so that's not a jurist. Okay, so jurist comes out of something. Right? So we have the Hanafi school, which comes out of the Kufan school. We have the Maliki school, which comes out of the Medina school. We have the Shafi'i school, which comes out of the Medina school, plus certain things, and the Hanbali school as well. These are the four schools of fiqh, and we can see, inshallah, how they all come. It's not something that's just invented. It's not just a genius that came and read the Quran in a new way. Everybody comes out of something else, right? Albeit a serious level of criticism. Imam Malik doesn't agree, for example, with necessarily all the great, his great predecessors in the Medina school. Imam Abu Hanifa doesn't necessarily agree with all the great predecessors in, there's a level of editing, but there's a great, it's not called taqleed. We wouldn't call them muqallideen. We wouldn't call them people who are just copying, pasting, but they are being greatly affected, right? And this helps us understand the DNA of fiqh, right? The DNA of fiqh. So, was it on Monday? On Monday, when I'm teaching kids at school how to find out how to pray and what app to use, why is it that, for example, I tell them, on the app, select Hanbali, Shafi, Maliki, and don't select Hanafi. I'm teaching Shafi'is, right? So Shafi'is, Hanbalis, and Malikis, their prayer times are very, very similar, common ideas, right? For example, in the Shafi'i school, if you come, and the Shafi'i school, and the Hanbali school, and the Maliki school, if you come out of a coma in the Asr time, you pray Dhuhr and Asr on time. Okay, but Dhuhr is ended. It's Asr time. So it's Asr time. Dhuhr is ended while you were in a coma. May Allah protect us all. And you come out of your coma, and it's now Asr time. It is still considered Dhuhr time. For the Shafi'is, Hanbalis, and Malikis, you now pray Dhuhr and Asr on time. You're not making qada. It's not qada. So why is that? Well, why is that? That's another question. The point is that why is it in those three schools? Oh, here's the DNA. The Hanbali school comes from the Shafi'i school. The Shafi'i school comes from the Maliki school. There we go. Why is it that, for example, alcohol, so more of a discussion, just an idea. Why is it that alcohol, for example, in cosmetics is not a problem in the Hanafi school? Why? Because the Kufans had a different approach to alcohol than the Medinans and the Medinans and the Meccans. So why is it today that you might get this fatwa that, it's okay because it's synthetic alcohol as opposed to this alcohol? Like, why is that even relevant? Where does it even come from? It comes back from way back then. Why is it that it's not so simple, not so clear in the other schools? Similarly, the idea of the witness and the plaintiff's oath, right? So in the Shafi'i, Maliki, and Hanbali schools, if I have one witness plus my own oath, that counts as two witnesses. So by default, all the schools agree that in issues of finance we need two witnesses. But according to the Shafi'i school, Hanbali school, and Maliki school, we have this thing. Why is it that it's in the Hanbali school and also in the Shafi'i school and also in the Maliki school? Because they're all part of one school. That's why. Now, is it always like that? No, by no means. You will find, again, things being taken because people are always being critical, and they don't necessarily always agree. And so a very good example then, if we look at the Muwatta of Imam Muhammad, you can see Imam Muhammad, who is a student of Imam Hanifa, taking from the Medina school, right? Therefore making the Hanafi school a bit wider than it originally is, right? And each school has things like this. However, that's the general picture. Khair. Any questions so far? Sulaiman, Shahid, Fahad, Atif?
Not really.
Right. Is it all making sense? Where these things come from?
Yes, so far.
Aisha, Fahima? Or Fahima? Is it Fahima or Fahima?
Fahima.
Fahima.
Jazakallah.
Okay. So Fahima means the woman who understands. Fahima means the woman who is in whom understanding has become an attribute, something about you. So Fahima means you are born understanding, right? As opposed to Fahima, which means somebody who's now understanding. Alhamdulillah. Kamran, Sulaiman, Atif. Oh, okay. So that was the proto-madhabs and the four schools. Okay, and now just very, very, again, cursory look at primary sources of Islamic law. So what is Islamic law based on? Okay, so obviously on the Quran, nobody debates about that, and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, and on scholarly consensus. So after the demise of the Prophet ﷺ, after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, when the Sahaba all agreed on something, that became the deen. That is just the religion. Next generation, when they all agreed upon something, that was then the religion. And the next generation, the next generation, and the next generation. Right? This is what we call al-ijma', consensus, scholarly consensus. Okay? And then we have analogy. So, has the Quran and Sunnah answered every single legal or moral problem that ever will be? No. Has consensus, is there consensus on every single thing that will be? No. Legal scenarios, moral scenarios are in principle infinite. Every single day there's going to be a new question, every single day. So we solve it through analogy. This is like this. Sometimes the Quran and the Sunnah give us general principles that do actually include new cases, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they don't. Right? And sometimes we have to do analogy. Okay. Now, when we're looking at the Sunnah, so we all believe that if we were in front of the Prophet ﷺ and he said this or he said that, we'd listen to him. Okay, but I'm not in front of the Prophet ﷺ. And we know that some hadiths are authentic, some hadiths are not authentic. Right? And this is the course we just finished 2 weeks ago. But what is deemed authentic? What does authentic mean? The criteria of authenticating a hadith, did the Prophet ﷺ actually say these words or not, are not agreed upon. The conceptual criteria and then the application of that criteria are not agreed upon. Not agreed upon. So there's a problem. When we're dealing with the Sunnah, there's a problem, right? Certain scholars will accept something and certain scholars will not. And so when I'm saying, well, this is the Sunnah, well, yeah, I do believe in the Sunnah, but is these words, did the Prophet say them or not? We have to research this. We have to research the concepts. How would we authenticate a hadith? And then we actually have to apply that and make sure it's been applied properly. Another classic issue is what if the Sunnah goes against the Quran? A hadith goes against the Quran. How do we deal with that? How do we deal with that? Right? What if, for example, there's a hadith where the Prophet ﷺ was asked about Bedouins, new Muslim Bedouins who brought meat from the desert. And the Muslims who had been Muslim for a while, they knew about halal and haram meat. Whereas these Bedouins who just became Muslim a week ago, we're not sure, do they even know about halal and haram meat? And so we're not sure, do they know how to say this? Do they say Bismillah or not? And so there's countless verses of the Quran, maybe 4 or 5 very clear verses of the Quran that say you have to say Bismillah when you slaughter an animal. But then there's a hadith where the Prophet said, oh, well, just you say Bismillah. So how do we deal with that? Do you reject the hadith? Does it qualify each other? Does one take precedence over the other? How does that work? That's a very difficult conversation to have. Very, very difficult. It's not easy. There are scenarios where clearly one is commentating the other, where there's clear kind of almost conflict, but how does it work? How do we deal with that, right? And so we deal with it in various different ways, right? And as we mentioned in the previous course, there's not in reality a conflict between Allah and the Prophet. That's not what we're saying. Well, Allah wants one thing and the Prophet wants something else. That's not what we're saying. We're saying is, how sure are we that this is revelation and this is revelation, given that a hadith is sometimes authentic and sometimes not, and it's sometimes well known and sometimes not well known, whereas the Quran is all well known. There's no question about it. It's just widespread, whereas the individual hadiths are not so widespread. And so how do we deal with that? How do we deal with it? So that's one of the problems when dealing with the Sunnah. For example, another example, does it mention in the Quran that you can have, so in the Quran, it mentions having 2 witnesses, whereas in the hadith, there's a scenario where you can have a witness and your own oath. So is that a conflict or is that an explanation? How do we deal with that again? Right? How does it work? And so it's an important discussion. Now, there's repercussions on the difference of agreement among the scholars, right? Okay, so looking at consensus. Okay, well, number one, whose consensus do we listen to? Well, is it all of the Muslims like this? Is it all the scholars like this? What if there's a scholar but not a Muslim? How does that work, right? What if no agreement is reached? What if, for example, they agree on 3 positions? There's 10 scholars and they agree on 10 things. Does that mean they agreed on the 10, or that they just simply disagreed? So the next generation, can they come up with an 11th position or not? So if, for example, if the Sahaba said one thing and another thing, does that mean they disagreed? Or does that mean they agreed on these 2 positions? What is that? What about after the companions? Again, these are discussions. But if you go through all the discussions of consensus, you have about 18 different types of consensus. All of them vary a level of strength. So consensus is not an easy thing. It's a nice concept. We all agreed, therefore it's fine. But can you prove that we all agreed? Sometimes people will claim, oh, everybody says this. And it's not the case. It's not the case, because maybe you're just not aware of another opinion. You're just not aware of another opinion. It's quite difficult to do that. Fine. And then analogy. This is analogous to this. This is like this. Well, how clear does it have to be? Exactly. Right. How similar does it have to be? What if a new case is like two conflicting precedent cases? So it's like this and it's like that. How do you deal with that? What if there's 2 scenarios? And this is the role of the jurist, right? The role of the jurist is exactly this. It's like this, but it's not like this. So 95% of the time, the jurist is not dealing with the Quran and Sunnah, because he's already read the Quran and Sunnah. It's limited, right? And consensus is limited. He's trying to deal with analogy, right? Fiqh, what does it mean? Fiqh, it means understanding, meaning understanding why, right? Why? So I now have to say, well, this is like this because of this. What is the why? What is the illah, the legal reason behind it? Is it this or is it this? If it's this, does it actually apply in this scenario or not? And then we have conflicts. This is where it gets very difficult, where you say this makes it halal, but this makes it haram. And it's very difficult. You have a whole spectrum of similar cases where there is a conflict between 2 things, right? Conflict between 2 things, and one aspect is increasing, one aspect is decreasing, right? 2 opposing things. And so this is the difficulty in law. Difficulty in law is it like this or is it like that? That's why you have to continue with debates, right? etc. Similar primary sources. So the fatwa of a companion. So generally speaking, few scholars really absolutely say that if, for example, somebody who studied with the Prophet can give a fatwa that makes it halal. Few will actually say that in an absolute sense. Practically speaking, it's very significant. Why is that the case? So is it an absolute source of law? Not really. It's not really. According to most people, it's not, right? You'll see it here and there, but it's not really. But why is it so significant? Because of the momentum of a tradition. So you'll find Abdullah ibn Mas'ud said X. His students all said X. His students all said X. You get this momentum. The Hanafi school says X. You say, well, Hanafi school, what is your proof for this? Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. You say, well, is he a primary source of halal, haram? No. So what's your proof? Good point. You say, well, actually, is that momentum that Abdullah Mas'ud looked at the Quran and Sunnah and came to this conclusion. His students listened to his opinion, looked at the Quran and Sunnah and agreed. And so you get this momentum that is very difficult to break, right? If I come along and I'm going to try and change American law into English law, how can you do that? There's so much momentum, so many concepts, so many ideas that you can't just change like that. The way that US law works with contracts and all these different things is different to British law, common law, it's different. And so it's very, very difficult to do that. And so even though you'll frequently find, say, well, where's the proof for something in the Quran and Sunnah? Because isn't the Quran and Sunnah the revelation? And as far as I know, Ibn Umar, Abdullah Mas'ud, Ibn Abbas, these are not prophets, these are people, and they make mistakes, right? And so, yeah, but generally what happens is don't look at it as a primary source, look at it more from the point of view of tradition, right? So Zayd ibn Thabit solved this inheritance problem like this. The scholars of Medina agreed. The next generation agreed. Imam Shafi came along and said, yep, makes sense. Say, well, Imam Shafi, didn't you tell us that it was haram to blindly follow somebody else? Is yes, it is haram to blindly follow somebody else. Correct. But I am not blindly following Zayd ibn Thabit. Right? So you might quote as the proof for this is Zayd ibn Thabit. You say, well, he's just a young Sahabi. What's the big deal? So, yeah, but the momentum that was caused by that fatwa. Right? And so there are many things like this. It's a very important thing to understand. When you say, give me my dalil, give me my proof, you will often not find it in the Quran and Sunnah. And how do you understand that? Go back to the DNA of fiqh, right? Other discussions, for example, the inveterate practice of Medina, Amal Ahl Medina. So you'll find this again in the Muwatta of Imam Malik. He will quote a hadith, quote a Sahabi, quote another Sahabi, and then say, "Wala amalu andana kada." What is done is this. So what he's talking about is very much that this idea of what the early scholars of Medina did. They all did this. This is now the deen. That concept of precedent is very strong for Imam Malik. So that's important, and it is important, right? It is important to others as well. You'll find a lot of this. The concept of precedent of the early Muslim scholars is very important to everybody. But is it a binding absolute argument? No, it's not. To most people. Right? And so, for example, just to give an example, or even though Imam Muhammad jumped from one school to another school and took certain positions from the Medina school, at the same time, he wrote a whole essay saying why the Medina school is wrong. So he's very much a Kufan, but he's an open-minded Kufan, as is any real scholar. They are open-minded. They take from this, take from that. Right? No modern scholar or ancient scholar is, they're all like that. Because they again, it's not an indoctrination. It's not a process. Learning a madhab is not an indoctrination. It's a process of graduating. So the difference between al-khuruj an al-madahib, abandoning the schools of fiqh and starting something new, and at-takharruj an al-madahib, to graduate from the schools. So these people are graduates, right? And they may agree or may disagree. Okay, so we mentioned all of these things, primary sources of Islamic law, and now we're going on. Any questions so far? Am I speaking way over your head? Does it makes perfect sense? You have no questions, or I'm speaking way over your head, so you have no questions? what's going on in your heads, you guys? So this is an interactive course. Again, I said I'm not a lecturer, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scholar. I'm just sharing general ideas.
Everything is making sense so far.
Okay, great.
Same. Yeah.
Okay, Kamran. So you just answered now. Altif, everything's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, so now we're on to primary sources. Interpretive principles. Okay. Interpretive principles. So we have the Quran and the Sunnah and consensus and analogy. Okay. So we have a verse of the Quran. Okay. We have a verse of the Quran or a hadith. What's a good example? A hadith. Right. For example, the Prophet ﷺ said, when one of you enters a mosque, then let him not sit down until he prays 2 rak'ahs. Okay, the hadith is, when one of you enters a mosque, let him not sit down until he prays 2 rak'ahs. Wonderful. So as an interpretive principle, does the hadith independently, for example, give us halal haram? Or does it have to be in the Quran? That's an interpretive principle, right? We would say, no, it doesn't have to be in the Quran. Okay, another interpretive principle. If the Prophet or Allah says, don't do something, what's the assumption? Is it that it's forbidden? Is it that it's offensive? What is it? In fact, what are even the categories that we're going to try and put things into anyway? So we have to have certain interpretive principles that are there, and these are called qawaid usuliyya or usul al-fiqh. They have to be there, and then are applied to the primary text. Otherwise, it's going to be subjective. I read the Quran and I got this feeling. Go, well, what is the principle? Are you working on a systematic linguistic principle or not? Right? And so you have to have these things. So, for example, is there such thing as metaphor? Right? Who's heard the idea religion is based on metaphor? Right? So I say my interpretive principle is every single thing in the Quran and Hadith is metaphorical. That's an interpretive principle. Or the opposite. There is not a single thing in the Quran and Sunnah that is metaphorical. Everything is literal. Or is it more nuanced than that? For example, that I'm going to assume everything is metaphorical until proven otherwise. Or I'm going to assume everything is literal until proven otherwise. And what do you mean proven? Right? These are interpretive principles. Okay? And there's many things beneath this. For example, an inclusive statement. Englishmen are boring. That's an inclusive statement that includes every single Englishman. Okay, well, if I find a statement like that in the Quran, is it actually exhaustive? Should I assume that or should I not assume that? For example, the verse of the Quran that says, Inna salata, indeed the prayer, was and ever will be obligatory on the believers at fixed appointed times. So we have a general statement here. The prayer, meaning Fajr, Dhuhr, Maghrib, Isha, Fajr. Right? Dhuhr, Asr, Maghrib, Isha, Fajr. The 5 daily prayers. That means every single prayer, okay, is obligatory on the believers. That means believers, a general statement. That means every single believer at fixed appointed times. So if that's literal, that means there's no such thing as joining prayers ever. If it's not literal, then it means the prayer is never obligatory at fixed times. So how do I work with this? Where do I start? How does it start? You just work it out as you go along? Or are there objective systems programs that you apply to the primary sources and you get a conclusion? Right? The answer is you have an objective system. So each school of fiqh has an objective system. They plug in that to the primary sources and they get objective conclusions. It's not just subjective, right? It would be subjective as I think it would be nice if there's no Ramadan under COVID-19 because it's really difficult. Okay, great. So my conclusion is already drawn. I don't want to fast Ramadan under COVID-19. Okay. So then where is it in the Quran and Sunnah? This. There we go. That's called subjective. That's not a real answer. Right? The answer is the real debate that we have in fiqh is the presupposed interpretive principle. So I'll just mention one, just to have an idea of how advanced it is, but that's how it works. For example, that, it's more of a linguistic discussion, but it's an interpretive discussion, is that in an all-inclusive statement, like Englishman, includes every member of its class categorically. And majority of the scholars say no, not categorically, probabilistically. For example, that is a linguistic / interpretive principle that results in countless differences of agreement and halal haram, and in countless scenarios. So linguistically, when I say Englishmen are boring, does it include every single member? Does it include every single member of that class, Englishmen, categorically or probabilistically? Meaning, is it 100% sort of certain that includes every single member or not? Right? There's countless scenarios that apply from that. Right? A general statement, many things like that. Right? When the Prophet ﷺ says making ghusl on Jummah is obligatory on every single person who has reached puberty. Is obligatory. Do I have to assume that it's obligatory because he said obligatory, or is it not? Could it be assumed otherwise? Right? There's countless scenarios like this, countless scenarios where, and we need to define where we're going to start. Are we going to start with something to be, if there's such thing as metaphor, is there not? If there is such thing as metaphor, where's the assumption? How do we work it? Right? Is it, for example, as they say, religion is based on metaphor, therefore everything in the Quran and Sunnah could be metaphorical? Do we believe, for example, do we apply, for example, systems like deconstruction, right? Where there's the continual spiral of inner symbols that kind of mutate at any time. How does it work? These are all interpretive principles that we talk about. And it's worth noting there are many very advanced linguistic discussions that the scholars of Islamic law spoke about, right? Starting with Imam Shafi and thereafter, but they're quite advanced, they're quite unique. They are not grammar, they are not really there are lots of psycholinguistics that come in, science of usul al-fiqh and the science of balagha, but there's a lot of things that have been said, lots of very fruitful, purely linguistic discussions, right? How do you deal with conflict as well, for example? So number one, you have to define your list. What are your sources of law, and how do you work with them? How do you order them, right? This is a process. Again, it's an app. You plug in the primary sources, the verses, the Quran, the Hadith, you get a conclusion. What are the conclusions you're trying to draw anyway? Right? So you're trying to plug in this app and you're trying to find halal or haram. Okay, well, is there halal or haram and something in between? Yeah, there's makruh. Well, is there makruh tahriman? Makruh tanzihan? Right? Is there, for example, key thing in contracts? The Medinan school, Maliki, Shafi, Hanbali, they believe in a I don't know what to say. They don't believe in a tripartite level of contracts. A contract is either valid or invalid. A marriage is either valid or invalid. A prayer is either valid or invalid. That's how it works. For the Kufans, they have valid, invalid, and fasid. So you could have a fasid marriage contract. You could have a fasid, for example, sales contract. To give an example, I lend Atif $100 and I say you got to give me back 110 next week. So how do I label, as a Shafi, I label that as an invalid loan contract. Like, why? Because it's riba, interest. So we say it's interest, it's haram. That's an invalid loan contract. Okay. How does Hanafi label it? As a sinful loan contract. So at the end of the day, it is a loan contract. There is a contract. So according to Hanafis, there is a contract, but you have to get rid of that haram in it. Say, I'm not going to give the money back. I'm not going to give you back what you borrowed, and that's it. Whereas for the Shafis, it's not a contract. This money's not even yours. So therefore, there'll be repercussions on the sales thereafter. That's not even your money, right? So let's say, for example, I borrow $100 off Atif, and then I die. If that's not a valid loan contract, my wife would not inherit from any of that money. Whereas if it is a valid loan contract, that money is actually mine and we owe it. So there's a slight difference, right? And that has a number of repercussions again in finance, where you could There's more sometimes more flexibility in the Hanafi school than other schools, because you've done something that can actually be corrected, whereas in the Shafi school or Maliki school, it's born dead. And the Maliki school in reality also has scenarios like that, right? And so the point is, what are the categories that you're trying to conclude? How many categories do you have, right? And so it could be, it's quite important to do that, right? And that's part of the creative mind, also the jurists. Like, what is the primary sources? What are they talking about? Are they talking about 5 categories, 6 categories, 7? What is actually being said? Other interpretive principles, the nature of a prohibition. So, for example, for the Hanbalis, they'll say prohibition results in invalidity without condition. So, for example, there might be certain immoral contracts that will be valid in the Shafi school, but yet considered immoral. Whereas for the Hanafi school, Hanbali school, generally it doesn't exist. Genuinely, it does not exist. You don't have an immoral contract that's valid, because prohibition means God doesn't accept it, meaning God doesn't recognize it. Whereas for the Shafis, they differ. Shafis and Malikis, we would say, if the prohibition is something that it applies to something that's merely tangential, then we can say the contract is still binding. Okay? Whereas, for example, a stooge, right? There's an auction and there's a stooge. Atif and Aisha, for example, are trying to rip me off. Okay? And there's this auction, and so Aisha keeps bidding up the money, bidding up the price of this car, for example, that I'm auctioning for, even though she doesn't want it. If she ends up winning the bid, they're just going to cancel the contract, because they're in the same business. And if I win the bid, I'm going to end up paying more than I would have otherwise, right? So they trick me. In the Shafi school, that's my own fault, because you look at the contract, you bought car X for this much money, it's valid contract, full stop. Whereas in the Hanbali school, you have a right to annul that contract. It's not actually binding, right? And so you have these differences. The interpretive principle will come out in different ways. Similarly, in the Shafi school, if I killed somebody and stole their water and their prayer mat and made wudu with their stolen water and prayed on their stolen prayer mat, my prayer will be valid but sinful. Whereas at the Hanbali school, it would not be valid to begin with, right? So how we deal, which categories exist. So in the Shafi school, we have something that is sinful and valid, and sinful and invalid. Genuinely, in the Hanbali school, that doesn't exist. It's either valid and halal or invalid and haram. In the Hanafi school, you can have more than that. You can have like 3 scenarios. It could be sinful, but has to be corrected, and sinful and sinful and valid, sinful that has to be corrected, and sinful that's invalid to begin with. And so it's quite complex. What is the output that you're looking for? What is the outcome that you're looking for? That's also part of the interpretive principles. And then we have juristic principles. So we get our primary source, verse of the Quran, hadith. We apply our app, your usul al-fiqh, your interpretive principle, and you get a rule. For example, the Quran, for example, principle in the Shafi school, a sahih hadith can qualify the Quran. Here's a hadith, for example, here's a verse of the Quran that says prayers at fixed time. Here's a hadith that indicates that you can join prayers. You can join prayers. There's the rule. Okay. We add the rules together. Rule plus rule plus rule plus rule are your outcome. And you realize there's a whole system. You get a meta rule. It's called a qaida fiqhiyya, a juristic principle. So we have qaida usuliyya, your linguistic, logical, theoretical assumptions. You have the primary source. You apply the bottom thing to the top, and you get halal haram. And you look at all the different scenarios of halal haram and say, hang on a minute, there's a system here. Every single time this happens, this is the case. This legal principle helps you expand the law to an infinite, if you were to write, for example, a book on marine Islamic trade law or Islamic marine law, it would all become based on these principles, right? You have all these principles. But it also helps you understand the original text. So we see that all the time. You will see that the primary source, the systems that exist in the fiqh, also help us to understand the fiqh. So you've heard the Prophet ﷺ say many things. You see a system, next time you hear him say something, it helps you understand what he's saying. For example, the Prophet ﷺ said, when you wake up at night, when you wake up from sleeping, don't put your hand in a container of water until you wash it 3 times. Okay, so is that obligatory or is that a sunnah? Well, he said, do it. That means you have to do it, right? That's a principle. When the Prophet says do something, that means you have to do it. Fine. Okay, well, why are you saying he doesn't mean do it here then? Well, because there's another principle that we've observed time and time again, that everything is assumed to be pure until proven filthy. And so if you have a hand that may be filthy, and you're going to put it in this bucket of water that may make it filthy, we know that it won't make it filthy because certainty of purity is assumed until proven otherwise. So now we know, because of this principle, that when the Prophet said, let him do that, it's not actually obligatory, right? And so we have these systems that help us also interpret the primary sources. So sometimes circular, right? So examples of juristic principles: certainty shall not be lifted by doubt, for example. So I made wudu. Okay, I think I broke my wudu. Yeah, I'm not sure though. You still have wudu. Okay, have you prayed or not? No, I haven't prayed. Okay, you got to pray then, because the certainty is you haven't prayed. Okay, I'm praying right now. Have I prayed 4 rakahs or 3 rakahs? Well, I'm not sure. Okay, assume certainties you've prayed 3, so you have to pray a 4th, right? You've given salams now. Assalamu alaikum, assalamu alaikum. Now you doubt, did I do 3 or 4? Well, you finished the prayer now. The default is the prayer is valid, right? So this principle is going to be applied in infinite scenarios. In ibadat, for example. In contracts, Atif and I go to Justice Smith and say, yeah, we have a conflict. I'm saying I sold you this book for $10. He said he didn't. So what's the default? Well, the default assumption is there's no contract. Okay, we both agree that the contract happened, but he's saying that it was an invalid contract and I'm saying it wasn't. And neither of us have any other evidence. What's the assumption? That it's a valid contract, because the assumption, the certainty is that a contract happened and the default is it's valid. And so the claim that it's invalid is meaningless. We both agree that the contract happened. We both agree that it's valid. But I'm saying $10, he's saying 5. Okay, what's the default assumption? 5. Because 10 is 2 5s. So we both agree on the 5 and we debate about the 10. So the assumption, the case goes with 5 until proven otherwise, etc. Countless scenarios like this, right? Countless scenarios. Somebody dies or somebody's missing. Can we inherit his wealth or not? Well, the default is he's still alive, right? And there's going to be various nuances in that scenario. So this is a consistent principle. Certainty is not lifted by doubt. We observed it, and then this is just a principle, full stop. Criminal punishment shall be avoided due to doubt, for example. Al-hudud tudra'u bil-shubuhat. For example, theft of a husband from his wife. Okay, so my wife, mashallah, is very, very wealthy. She has a house down the road, and she goes there with her friends now and then. It's not my house. She lives with me in my house that I'm renting, but she has a house down the road that she goes with her friends and does whatever with her friends on the weekend. Mashallah, wealthy woman. She doesn't give me the key, and I don't know what she does with her friends there. Inshallah, something halal. Right? And so I break into her house, and I steal a television, big screen television from her house. Now, what do we say? We say, okay, did you steal it? Did you break in? You broke in. Did you steal it? Okay, was it worth? We say, Farid, you are guilty of sariqah. You are guilty of theft. We're now going to cut your hand off. And I say, yeah, but my wife's money is like mine, right? I mean, we're married, right? And they're like, no. Your wife's money is never your money. Your money goes to your wife, true, but her money never goes to you. So unless she dies, but it doesn't, right? So her wealth is categorically sealed off from your wealth. So there is no doubt as to whether or not you kind of like were taking a kind of right or something, because there's no rights that you can take like that. Okay, what about vice versa? I have another house that I don't live in, and my wife knows about it. And she's like, oh, why'd you have that house? I'm like, none of your business, my house. She's like, okay. One day she breaks in, again, steals something from there that's worth a lot of money. My new computer. Her hand is not cut off. Why? Because there's a shubha. She has no legal right to that money. That's haram. That's my house. She can't do that. However, does money go from me to her? Do I spend on her? In a scenario, for example, where I didn't spend on her because she possibly take money from me, right? She might be able to force it from me out from the court. My money goes to her. Her money doesn't go to me. So there is a shubha, there's a question mark, right? And the mere fact that there's just a question mark means we cannot cut our hand off, full stop, right? We can't do it. You can't do things like that. So whenever there is any doubt, you cannot apply the had punishment. Any had punishment cannot be applied, right? We might do something else. We might, for example, punish her with what we call a ta'zir, a discretionary punishment. But you cannot apply a had punishment like that. They all have to work categorically. If there's any doubts, it doesn't work, right? And we'll come back to this. But this is a qaida fiqhiyya. It doesn't exist in ibadah. It doesn't come in ibadah, but it's a qaida fiqhiyya. For example, the point in contracts is the intent, not the words. So this is the thing that's debated. So in the Hanafi school, if I write a contract, the contract says that I sell you this house for 1 month, and you have to pay $2,000 for it. I sell you the house for 1 month. Okay, that's called a rental contract. That's not called a sales contract. You can't sell something for 1 month. It doesn't make sense. Anyway, that's what the piece of paper said. Okay. According to Hanafi, that's fine. Why? Because the point of the contract is the intent, not the word. So they use this dumb word. That's their problem. But they meant in rental. It's fine. In the Shafi school, that's an invalid. It's not a valid. It's not the words that you use were sales. It's not a valid contract. You cannot sell a house for a month. Therefore, it's an invalid contract. No money. You do not have right to the house, and you don't have right to the money. It's not a valid contract, right? So this is a debate, for example, a debated juristic principle. Duress shall permit the impermissible. Well-known thing. There's haram food. Yeah, but I'm going to die. I'm under duress. I would die if I can't eat it. Okay, fine. Eat it then. All right, marriage. I have a long-lost sister, and she's somewhere in the world. Okay, and it's haram for you to marry your sister. Yes, well, you know that not going to marry anybody, right? It will allow you to do that. And like, countless scenarios are like this. Blood in the sea. If blood makes things filthy, right? Blood is filthy. So a shark kills a seal in the middle of the Atlantic. Well, the Atlantic is connected to the Pacific. So that means the whole of the Pacific and the whole Atlantic is all filthy now. Okay, well, that would be duress. How on earth are we going to use water? If everything became filthy like that, then it would be impossible. Right? So this has many, many subcategories as well. Nakedness, right? I have an infection and I can't expose my thigh to somebody. Okay, well, you're going to die then. Okay, fine. Expose your thigh. Right? You can expose your thigh to somebody, to the doctor, because he's going to cure you. Otherwise, you die or you get infected, whatever. Duress shall be judged in its actual amount, for example. So most forms of conventional insurance, according to most modern scholars, are haram, right? Okay, well, I have house insurance. Okay, so when I was given the option of house insurance, I was forced. I can't rent a house without house insurance. Okay, so can I put double insurance? No. Duress shall be judged in its actual amount. So you are legally bound in this country, if you want to rent a house, to have housing insurance. Okay, fine. So you have no way to rent a house without it. Correct. Fine. So that bare amount is not on you. It's fine. You're not sinful for doing that. But if you added up other insurance, you'd be sinful. You can't do that. Right? There are certain forms of insurance that are halal, and so this is not to be taken as a fatwa, just as a general concept. Right? Nakedness. I'm allowed to expose my thighs, my left thigh to the doctor, so I'm going to expose my right thigh as well. And in fact, I'll take all my underwear off as well. Why? That doesn't make sense. You expose what you need to. So the injury itself, plus the skin around it that's needed. That's all. Right? You can't do more than that. Being excused from Friday prayer. I'm excused from Friday prayer because, for example, I'm a high risk to COVID-19. Okay. Well, why? Because what's wrong with you? I have this disease. Do you still have that disease? No. So then you have to go then, right? So we deal with, so if duress allows you to take 100 steps, you can take 100 steps. You can't take 101 steps, right? So duress shall be judged in its actual amount. Okay, so you always have to be careful of that. Sitting in prayer. I'm feeling really dizzy. So I'm going to sit down in my obligatory prayer. I don't feel dizzy anymore. Okay, we'll stand up then. You can't just finish the prayer like that. You now have to stand up. So you started the prayer sitting down because you felt dizzy. Okay, now for the rest of the prayer that you're no longer dizzy, you now have to stand up. Right. Returning defected goods. Right. So Atif sold me a car, and after a week I realized there's something seriously wrong with the engine. Okay. And so I have a right, duress allows me to return that. In principle, you can't do that, but duress allows me to do that. Fine. Does duress allow you to return it after a month? So you found out after a week there was a problem with the engine, and then you couldn't be bothered to do anything. So then you left it another 3 weeks, and then you decided I actually want the cash back. And you took it back to Atif. No, can't do that. Duress, for example, shall not strip others of their rights. So again, Atif's right to sell that car has been stripped of him by me delaying in taking the car back. Right, so you can't do that. A car crash. You were in a rush. The ambulance drove. The ambulance is in a rush. That's a darura. That's duress. They have to get to this hospital in time. They can break the speed limit, fine, but can they crash into people? They're not. So, and what if they do crash into people? What just because you were rushing, there was an emergency means that my car is allowed to be destroyed? No. So no one is sinful for crashing into my car. There was duress, but I do have a right for this harm to be remedied, right? So even in the scenario, for example, I don't know, so I don't know, someone's dying. That doesn't mean that you have to pay to save them. You might have to pay up front and get the money back or something like that. But the point is you have rights. So duress does not take other people's rights. And that's a very complex thing. It's quite complex. If you think about it, the idea of the duress, the dire necessity to use materials that destroy the environment. So does your necessity that allows you to do these things allow you to destroy the environment? In principle, no. Right? In principle, it doesn't. So in principle, just applying the principle as it is without any kind of, if, for example, we have to use fossil fuels because there is no other, we have to burn fossil fuels because there's no other, nothing that we could do right now and right in the now and in the immediate moment that we could change to, then in principle, applying this principle means you could not destroy the environment. So therefore, even if it was the only option, you couldn't do it, right? And obviously there are other factors in it. It's much more complex than that, but just applying the concept, right? So these are legal principles. So today we've looked at the jurisprudence fiqh as a skill and not an invention, the concept of the proto-madhabs that resulted in the four madhabs, primary sources of Islamic law in extremely brief sense, interpretive principles, conflicts in primary sources, how to deal with these things, and some juristic principles. Any questions or queries? Apologize, we went over time. Usually we're going to go for 40 minutes to an hour maximum. I'm not going to go to this much time. Any questions or queries?
No questions, Jazakallah khair.
Abdul Basit, Abida, Aisha, Fahima, Justice, Kamran.
Assalamu alaikum. This is Ridwan. I use my daughter computer, so it show up Aisha Ridwan.
Okay.
Everything is clear and alhamdulillah, it's good.
Yes, assalamu alaikum. Everything is very clear and very good. Thank you very much. I'm glad that I attended and I will try to continue all of them. Thanks for doing.
The Abida, last time I had who was my faithful companion, Atif. Atif was with me throughout the whole course. So we hope, Abida, that inshallah till the end we have 7 more lessons. Inshallah till the end you'll be with us, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. No other questions? Saad, Suleiman.
Yeah, I'm Hamida. I'm Abdul Basid's mother, just signing. Yeah, I really liked it. I would like to learn more about Islamic jurisprudence. So that's going to be a fun course, I hope.
Inshallah, khair, inshallah.
Thank you so
But
much.
please, as I mentioned, the most two important books are what? The fiqh according to the four schools. Again, if you look on the website, you will see all the books there. Fiqh according to the four schools, and the Search for God's Law by I can't remember who it is, but it's based on Ahmadi's also. So those two.
Right, and that was my question. Those were just, are those available online or
Yes,
those
they
are?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
But the other works are very important as well, but those are the most important, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.
Barakallahu feek. Jazakum khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.